Greetings. My name is Jalandra A. Davis, otherwise known as Mommy Melusine. I am a writer, scholar, educator, dancer, mermaid enthusiast, and all-around creative. Welcome to the Merwomanist podcast, where we talk about Black mermaid lore, fantasy, spirituality, and aquatic culture. Dive in and enjoy. Greetings, and welcome back to the Merwomanist podcast with Mommy Melusine. And today I am doing a short wrap up on some Black Mermaid short stories. I'm back to Black Mermaids for the last few episodes. I've been talking about fantasy, both fantasy books as well as fantasy TV. And yeah, I'm discovering that I really like talking about books. I mean, which would make sense as my career is reading and writing about books, but not necessarily the thing that I've spent the most time on in this podcast. In order for me to sustain the podcast, I really want to start thinking about it even more as an extension of the work that I already do as a professor and a way to think about and work through ideas about the different things that I am reading as I explore text for my Black Mermaid book project. So if you are listening, please check out the books I'm talking about. And if you're a scholar and you write about them, say where you found out about them. I've decided to focus this wrap up on stories that are in print anthologies that are not specific to mermaids. There is actually a Black mermaid, or kind of maybe not mermaid specifically, but Black aquatic slash mermaid short story anthology edited by Sheree Thomas called Tales from the Deep that I own and can't seem to find. So there's a whole bunch of stories in that I would love to talk about, but I think I'm probably going to go ahead and give that its own episode. There are also lots of Black mermaid short stories in different speculative fiction online magazines. So the first one is in Nalo Hopkinson's Report from Planet Midnight, and I believe this story is also available online as well. The story is called Shift. It is not exactly about a mermaid in the traditional sense, but if you've read any of my work, you know that I define mermaid very broadly. It is just an umbrella term that I use to refer to any kind of human-like sentient being, which could include deity that lives primarily in the water. Um, and I also include siren stories. Some siren stories depict sirens that don't necessarily live in the water, and there's actually one of those on my list. So I use it as a very expansive term. And the character who is the mermaid figure in this story is Sycorax, even though the name Sycorax is not actually used within the story. This story is not a retelling, but it is an allusion to Shakespeare's The Tempest. In the play The Tempest, there is a character called Caliban, and Caliban is pretty much a representative of a native person living on a deserted island. Well, not deserted because there's a native person there, but a native person living on an island that the magician Prospero and his daughter Miranda crash land on. And Caliban is depicted and described as being, I'm trying to think about ways to talk about this character that aren't offensive, right? But we're talking about Shakespeare. So Caliban is depicted and described as savage, right? That is the words that the people in the play use to describe him. Uncivilized, inarticulate, and he develops an infatuation with Miranda. Caliban is also the son of an offstage character called Sycorax, who is an oceanic, a sea being, and a sorceress. And she's referred to by people in the text as this odious witch, right? So she's kind of this witch, sorceress type of figure who's a haunting, foreboding presence in the play. Now, you can read Tempest if you want to know exactly what happens and what it's all about. But the important thing to know is that both Caliban and Sycorax have been taken up by Black scholars and artists as examples of the way in which white people think about Black or Indigenous manhood and womanhood. So you've seen both Black as well as Indigenous scholars and creatives do their own kind of retellings, adaptations, re-representations, reworkings of these figures, right? And so, though this is not a direct retelling, it is responding to this idea of Sycorax as this foreboding, haunting, scary, grotesque kind of Black/Indigenous femininity. Hope that all makes sense. And so, one of the things I really like about this story is the way that it's dealing with the lore of sea goddesses and creatures, in that this character that Shakespeare calls Sycorax is a being that precedes, transcends, surpasses all of the different names that have been applied to her. In one part of the story, she says, "She tell me, say, I must call her Skyla or Charbidis. Say it don't make no matter which, for she can never remember one different from the other, but she know one of them is her real name. She say never mind the name most people know her by is a name some Englishman give her by scraping a feather quill on paper. White people magic." So I think that's referring to the name Sycorax, which is not actually mentioned in the text. So this is a story about Caliban, but in this story, he is a contemporary man, or he is still a sea being, but who has come on land, taken human form, and he's in a relationship with this white girl. And he fears that his mother is calling him back to the sea. And his sister Ariel, who is kind of a spirit, an air spirit, is also calling him back to the mother of whom he seems to be deeply afraid. And so we finally do get a confrontation with the mother and find out that the story he's been telling us about himself and his mother is not necessarily the story, or at least it's not the story that she has. So it's quite interesting. It's really layered. I've read it many, many times and still, I'm going to admit, don't know that I completely understand everything she's trying to say. I think it is saying something about Black masculinity. I think it's maybe saying something about fetishization and interracial desire. I don't know. It's one of those stories that I love, but I have to read it over and over again to get the idea of what Hopkinson was actually trying to say with the story. But even if you just read it on a surface level, not really looking for the deeper meaning, it's just a really entertaining story. And the physical depiction of Sycorax as this sea goddess creature who some people have seen as a monster, some people have seen as a goddess, some people have seen as a witch. The physical embodiment of her, I think, is just really, really, really cool. Right. And I actually won't spoil it by describing it. I want people to read it for themselves. Let me say this. I'm going to say one more line from the book. This is from Caliban's point of view. "The last fairy tale princess who'd met your family hadn't stopped screaming for 2 days." Right. So I think I'll end that there. Yeah. So that is one of my favorites. And Nalo Hopkinson has a lot of mermaid stories and water spirit stories throughout her body of work. And maybe one day I'll do an episode devoted to Nalo and her mermaid work. The next story is Nana Nkweti's Living Infinite, which is in a single authored short story anthology called Walking on Cowrie Shelves. First of all, this collection is so good. It's so good. I used to really not like short story collections. I don't know why, but I have been reading a lot more short form fiction, short stories, novellas. I think some of it is just my attention span has been really challenged for the last few years. I think probably because I spend more time on the internet than I used to since the pandemic. Maybe some of it is that I never get enough sleep, but I just really enjoy reading short form fiction a lot more than I used to. And this is definitely one of my favorite collections. It is just so mixed genre. There are stories in here that are very horror feeling. There are stories that are just very contemporary fiction. There are stories that feel like thrillers. There's sci-fi. And so this, I would say, is very much a fantasy, is very much a contemporary fairy tale of the love story between a Mami Wata and a fisherman. So it's a mermaid fisherman love story, but it's placed in the cultural context of her being a Mami Wata who has lived for 200 years So who has experienced and been a part of these different events in Black history. And that is kind of woven in with the love story, which is just a simple, beautiful love story. So that is The Living Infinite in Nkweti's Walking on Cowrie Shells. My next story is in a collection edited by Jordan Peele called Out There Screaming, and it is a Black horror collection. And there is a story called Lasiren. I've talked about Lasiren on the podcast before. She is a deity in the Haitian religion Vodou, or sometimes Vodun, that is called. And she is a Lawa of the water. She is a manifestation of a Zili, who is the Awa Lawa, or sometimes a pantheon of Lawa of love, beauty, creativity, fertility, sexuality. And Lasiren is her mermaid aspect. Lasiren is also a manifestation of Mami Wata, and you see the same kind of physical imagery and iconography and stories about Mami Wata and Lasiren, particularly the idea that if Lasiren catches you near the water, then she might take you into her world. And you might never be seen again, or you might be returned after a period of time. And the most common numbers I usually see in these kind of stories is either 3 years or 7 years, and you return forever changed. Lasiren by Erin E. Adams is the story of 3 sisters and their mother, and their mother always tells them stories about Lasiren. So she says, never trust a woman alone in the water. She will have dark skin like ours and straight hair like theirs. If she calls to you, run before she can speak. If you are fool enough to hear, you must do as she says. Listen, or she'll snatch you and leave a shell in your place. So it's a beautifully written story. I did think that there were parts of the story that I found to be confusing, but it's okay. I enjoyed it. It's a very beautifully written story. I'm trying to decide how much I want to say about it in terms of spoilers. They do come in contact with Lasiren. The physical depiction is very unique, very, very beautiful. And these sisters do have to figure out how to survive and save one another when they come into contact with this being. So the last one that I'm going to talk about is in an anthology called Sycorax's Daughters. This is a horror anthology edited by Kinitra Brooks, Lyndon D. Addison, and Susanna Morris, with a foreword by Walida Imari. These are all scholars and creatives within the Afrofuturism, Black speculative fiction space. And it's a big collection, so I have not finished reading this. I've been reading this on and off for years, but I didn't read it cover to cover because it's a thick collection, and I have not read every single story. So for all I know, there are more Black mermaid stories in here. But the one that I'm going to talk briefly about is Scales, and it is a story by Shireen Sherrard. And it is about 2 sisters and their mother who are sirens. They live on land, they live in the human world. And the mother is definitely a siren. She definitely can take a mermaid form. She's not described exactly the way a sort of contemporary mermaid lore. And you read the story for yourself to see exactly how she's described. But it seems that her daughters are not full sirens in the way that she is, and that they inherited different powers and abilities. So one of the sisters, Cassia, can actually swim underwater. She doesn't need a lot of air. She's really effective in the water. She could swim long distances. She's able to travel to other communities of sirens and be a part of that world, where Vriel cannot. Vriel doesn't have the same kind of ability to survive in the deep ocean, is what I gather. This story also, at certain points, I found is a very mysterious story, and there were certain points where I wasn't quite sure what was happening, or whether Vriel is not a full siren because she can't do it or because she doesn't want to be. Vriel is very resistant to her siren identity. And I'm using the word siren not because the text uses it. I'm actually not even sure if the story specifically says siren, The story just kind of says like us or our race, right? They don't call themselves mermaids. They don't call themselves sirens. Like the story is very grounded in the real world. And Vriel, particularly, is really hesitant to connect herself to these stories that she's grown up hearing about mermaid lore. She doesn't think of herself in that way. And it seems like she wants to have a regular life and she wants to have regular relationships. The reason that I call them sirens is because they both seem to have a lot of power over men. They both have a song and that through which they can tempt and control people's will, and people can have an insatiable attraction and desire for them. And they can't always control it. And sometimes things can go very wrong. So I think part of what is going on is that Brielle is struggling to have a regular romantic relationship. And it's hard for her to distinguish when a man actually loves her or when it is her siren power, right? And sometimes things with this siren power just go really, really wrong. So she's very resistant to fully embracing that identity where her sister fully embraces it. I call them sirens because of this aspect of the song and being able to attract people's wills, which in siren stories does not always coexist the mermaid form or living in the water, right? There are some siren stories that just kind of focus on that power. And at least for Brielle, that seems to be the case for this one. It's a beautiful story. I did think it was a little mysterious. I did feel like the protagonist, even in a short story, one of the sort of rules of fiction is that you want to see a change in your main character. And I did kind of feel like, did the story end up in a different place than it started in terms of Riel and the way that she feels about her siren identity? I don't know. I still enjoyed it a lot. It was the only time it kind of specifically references Black Mermaid lore when Cassia, in trying to kind of get her sister to embrace who she is, talks about there are people who worship us. They leave offerings that they put on boats and send out into the ocean. So I think that's definitely referring to the kinds of ceremonies that we find in African-derived religions, such as Vodou or Regla de Ocha or Candomblé, where offerings are made to these Loa or Orisha of the water by sending out little boats full of offerings to them. And it was similar to the shift in the sense that it basically suggests that there are these creatures or beings in the water, that they're there, and that there are aspects of them that appear in the stories about them, but really that these beings precede and transcend any of the specific names, right? So different people might call these beings by different names, might tell different stories about them, might pray to them, might pray to them in different ways, but that the beings themselves kind of exist beyond that, right? Or they pre-existed. But they do also recognize these offerings and these prayers and these stories as being about them. I don't know if that makes sense, right? So that's the last one I'm going to talk about today. I will be doing another short story wrap up because there's a lot more Black Mermaid short stories where that comes from. And I'm going to stop here until next time. You have just listened to the Merwomanist podcast with Mommy Melusine. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, I would love 5 stars, and subscribe for future episodes. You can follow me on Instagram at Mommy, that's MAMI_Melusine, or at Merwomanist Podcast, on LinkedIn at Jalandra Davis, or my website, jalandradavis.com. Wishing you love and laughter and hoping to see you swim this way again.